Welcome to the Classical GABFEST, a weekly discussion about the ever-changing world of classical music. I'm your host for this week, Tiffany Liu, and with me as always are Kensho Watanabe and William White. And this week we are also joined by the hosts of the Creative Baggage podcast, Bailey Spiteri and Serena Huang. This week we'll be discussing the Creative Baggage podcast, then we'll turn the show over to Bailey and Serena so that they can ask us about our own creative baggage. And finally, we'll talk about how this summer's National Flute Convention sparked a broader discussion about equity and professional development in the arts. But first, we like to start with our prelude segment. So, Will, what do we have today?
This week, we'll be playing a round of everyone's favorite game, Game of Pairs. All right, here is how this game is played. I have chosen two composers who share a similar musical style, and I'm going to play three selections that my co-host and our guests will listen to and try to guess who wrote each one of them. This week's composers are Franz Schubert and Carl Maria von Weber. But before we get into the game, let's briefly discuss what makes these composers' styles similar and different.
All right, so first of all, Schubert and von Weber were contemporaries. I very much associate kind of like Schubert with more of like string chamber music, and then Weber very much with like wind concerti. So obviously it's probably not going to be that easy in terms of what we listen to, in terms of being like, oh, this is strings, so therefore it must be Schubert. But that might be a good launching point. Tiff, what do you think?
I mean, when I think of Weber, I'm thinking of like, he's a particular style approach to the orchestra, which is like a lot of first violin acrobatics and then like burying it in orchestration from the rest of the orchestra. And also, I think Weber has a greater affinity, although I'm not sure of this, for like larger staged works. We have overtures of his from operas and the like. So, you know, there's a style difference in terms of subject material, but again, Will is not going to make it that easy for us. I mean, I do think of Schubert as a melodist. I think that he is more of one than Weber, even though Weber has these kind of acrobatic aspects to his writing. I think Schubert is the more songful of the two.
I agree. I when I think of Schubert, I think of much stronger melodic material than Weber.
I don't know. I've always associated Weber with brass players. I feel like they like Weber, and as a flute player, we have a few like Schubert transcriptions that I've played, so that's my biggest association.
All right, very interesting thoughts, everybody. Best of luck here. Here is your first excerpt. Well, what do you think?
Well, based on everything that we've said, Weber. That feels pretty comfortable to me, right? I mean, we have a choral kind of texture that's going on with, sounds like exclusively wind and brass instruments. I don't know, in terms of the harmonic language, it feels very kind of traditional chord progression. I don't know, there was something at the end there that made me feel like, okay, yeah, that's almost certainly Weber, just because of how nicely and neatly the phrase wraps up, although Schubert does do this. I think he becomes more inventive later in his career, but I feel pretty comfortable saying that that's Weber. You guys?
I totally agree. It sounds like something that a concert band would be playing. I mean, right. Not just because of the instrumentation. I think like the voicing of it immediately reminded me of other Weber things I've played in concert bands.
Yeah, it's kind of dense. I feel like Schubert can be a bit more sparse sometimes.
Yeah, I'm with Bailey there, and the voicing very much reminded me of Weber writing. So I think we're all on the same page here. Let's see if Will has a curveball for us.
Well, you are all incorrect. And Tiffany, actually, you had a very excellent point there, which is that this piece comes from earlier in Schubert's career. So the things that you were saying that, he changed later on that might not be reflective here. This is a piece with a great title. It's called Eine kleine Trauermusik. So a little bit of, mourning music, of sad, tragic music.
Mourning with a U, though.
Yes, mourning with a U, tragic music.
Not like the Eine kleine Morgen music.
Yeah, not Eine kleine Morgen music, which would also be a great name for it.
It was not referencing that. Yeah. Okay, got it.
Okay, swing and a miss for the four of us.
That's right.
Good job, guys.
Okay, better luck on the next one. Here is your second excerpt.
I mean, by law of probability in this game, we want this to be Weber so that the third one remains a mystery to us. So I don't know. I mean, that game psychology seems to work with us most of the time in this game just because we still want the third round to be valuable. But that said, even so, one thing I didn't say earlier about Weber is like how florid he tends to be with his solo writing. It just tends to kind of go in these kinds of circles of fifths type of flights of fancy, we'll say. Like that very much fits with my image of his solo writing in particular. So, I don't know, by law of probability and also by what I hear here, I think I'm going to go Weber.
Kensho?
Well, yeah, that's the only thing I thought about even before listening to this excerpt.
Right.
Okay, so if the first one is Schubert, and if the second one is also Schubert, then the third one has to be Weber. So I'm going to go Weber here just to be safe.
I've also never heard any piano works by Weber, to be honest.
Yeah, this is a piano concerto or something.
Yeah, it sounded like a piano concerto, and I didn't know that he'd written any. Although, I would be even more surprised if Schubert had written a piano concerto and I hadn't heard of it also.
I feel a little need to be contrarian and say Schubert just because everybody is saying.
If you guys both say Schubert, then and if you're right, then the host of the Creative Baggage podcast can come in and sweep us. So that would be exciting.
I'm going to say Schubert based on just that.
No, I'm sorry, I have to go with Weber because Serena and I don't actually agree on anything fundamentally, so.
Okay.
All right, well, the Weber folks have it here. Sorry, Serena. Yeah, I mean, I think that there are two big giveaways here. One is that Schubert did not write any concertante music for piano and orchestra, whereas Weber has two piano concertos, which unfortunately don't get played very much. I mean, I hope that you thought from those brief 30 seconds that you heard that it's quite delightful music. And it has a very Mozartian flair. And that's something that hasn't come up yet, is that Weber was a relation by marriage to Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and really looked up to him and modeled a lot of his music after Mozart in many ways. So that might be something to think about. All right, here is your third excerpt.
Ein steter Kampf ist unser Leben, sein Wert, Gefühl. Wir ahnen, wünschen, hoffen, streben und sind am Ziel. Oft keimt aus allen unser Tränen kein Glück uns auf. Oft schließt mit ungestilltem Sinn.
So the language of the text doesn't help us here because it's German, obviously, and they're gonna both write in German.
Do you understand any German, Kensho?
A little bit. I picked up wünschen, and that was it.
Which is what, wind?
Which is wish, isn't it? Wünschen?
Yes, wünschen means wish.
Yeah, so there, one word. The only vocal stuff that I know of Weber is actually, regrettably, just only Freischütz arias.
His opera, Der Freischütz.
Yes, his opera, Der Freischütz. With Schubert, of course, they're all the songs and all of this. So, and then this kind of angsty Sturmendrang stuff could be either of them too.
Yeah.
So it's hard to say that characteristic is also indicative of one or the other. I was trying to listen for something kind of harmonically that might give it away, because usually with these excerpts, there's probably like one clue that helps us actually determine who it is, but I couldn't find it. Tiff?
I don't have anything. I mean, we've talked about Schubert's oeuvre on here in terms of like, there are the greatest of the great, but then there's also this like sea, like the iceberg underneath the cap that we all know, all sounds kind of like this harmonically, right? It's very kind of has the standard progressions, a little bit square on the phrase endings. Of course, we all know the things that poked out above the iceberg, but this is obviously going to be from something that we don't know.
Bailey or Serena, any thoughts?
My heart says Schubert.
I feel like the piano writing, in the sense of like the harmony combined with the motion of the piano, sounds very Schubert to me. Like, it's not just what the notes are or the way that they're placed or the rhythm. Like, all of it together has a very Schubert package to me, especially when the piano goes like, and then kind of fades away like that. Where, like, that to me is so Schubert that I would be dumbfounded if it wasn't. But then again, I'm not familiar at all with their Freshshoots or any of Weber's vocal stuff. So my heart says Schubert.
But this could just as easily be like, I mean, even if all we knew of Weber was his vocal writing for this stage, it could very easily be like a reduction or something like this. Mm-hmm. In which case, it actually would kind of sound like this. Actually, a reduction of an orchestral part may very well, that's a pretty easy reduce.
Also, if he wants to trick us and Schubert has more vocal,
that's right.
is more known for vocal stuff.
Just by knowing Will, like, I think where I'm going to go is like that, betting that Will would think that we identified this language, musical language, not language, with Schubert, and therefore it is Weber. And it's only because I have no musical insights. Like, Will, you picked a good one here, but regrettably, none of us is astute enough to suss out whatever clue that you think will give it away, which you always have one, and I can't wait to hear what it is.
I'm going to go Weber then.
All right, we've got one for Weber. Where else are you guys?
I'm Schubert. I'm gonna be dumb and not think
one for
about
Schubert.
game.
No, that's always me. That's usually me in this game. So.
Does it work out for you generally?
Half and half.
Yeah, it's kind of a coin flip.
All right. Well, my heart says Schubert, so.
Okay, Tiff, where are you on?
I'm Weber.
You're Weber. Okay. Well, the Webers have it. And
oh yes.
Sometimes this game is about making a point. And the point that I was trying to make here was that Weber is an amazing composer, very much underappreciated, I think, writing in many of the genres that we really appreciate. Now, when I chose this song, I can't say that there's one particular detail in here that I think made it stand out as Weber. What I would say is I could have chosen a lot of other Weber songs that sound way more like Schubert than this one. Again, I would just say that to me, this song sounded a little bit more Mozart-y, has a little bit more of that sound of, in particular, I would say the magic flute. And it has that operatic sound, Tiffany, that I think you were pointing out, that it almost sounded like a reduction rather than a pianistic part that would be a little bit more Schubertian in its affect, but really a tough one. And this was a tough pair of composers.
So what is it? Did you actually say the title?
Yeah, sure. So the song is called Klage, which means like moaning or complaint, grievance by Weber. And I didn't make it any easier by choosing Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau as the performer here. The main guy of Schubert fame. All right, well, that just about does it for this week's Prelude segment. But before we wrap up, we'd like to remind our listeners that we do periodic listener-generated Name That Tune rounds. So we invite you to try to stump us. Check our show notes, where you'll find a link to the form where you can upload a 30-second clip of an unidentified piece of classical music for us to try to identify. And with that, we move on to our first topic. Kensho, what do you have for us?
Creative Baggage is a conversation-based podcast giving voice to the unspoken baggage of pursuing a career in the arts. The show is hosted by Bailey Spiteri and Serena Huang, who met as classmates studying the flute at Temple University in Philadelphia. Much like the GABFEST, Creative Baggage launched a few months into the start of the pandemic, at a time when Bailey and Serena were faced with finishing their undergraduate degrees in very uncertain times. Bailey and Serena have recently launched Season 4 of their podcast. In the first episode, the hosts reflect on major developments in their lives post-graduation. We at the GABFEST are thrilled to collaborate with Creative Baggage this week. Bailey, Serena, thank you for joining us.
Yay, thank you for having us.
So, as I mentioned, we are both pandemic era podcast babies, and it would be great if you could talk about the launching of your podcast, Creative Baggage. Why did you start the show? How did you come up with the concept of Creative Baggage?
Serena and I found ourselves having these conversations very early into our freshman year, sophomore year in college, of crazy philosophical career type questions. I mean, multiple nights a week. And that was something that we continued to do, and honestly did even more when the pandemic hit, because we had nothing else to do. So we were just sitting and talking and ruminating about all these things that were churning in our brains. And one day I kind of was like, maybe we should share these or bring other people into the conversation. So we started the podcast as a way to kind of vent and share some of the baggage that we were dealing with. Serena was graduating the first year in 2020, the first year of the pandemic, and I was entering my senior year of college, and we were very lost and felt like, you know, the whole world was against us as young artists. So we decided to share that, and in sharing that, we found out that most of our colleagues felt the same way, but were just too afraid to share it. We kept going, and now we're here.
You guys have an experience that you are talking about right now that we simply don't have, and that's just being music students during the pandemic. I mean, I assume that a lot of the conversation that started this podcast kind of is rooted in that window into the world. And so what are the, I'm not going to say highlights because it's not a highlight, right? It's like what are the big takeaways, I guess, and are they, is it getting better? What's the deal right now?
I mean, I guess for me, I only had a handful of months before I fully graduated, which was also terrifying.
Yes.
But I think simply having all of the major, like, look forward tos of music school, like your senior recital, graduation, playing like your final few orchestra concerts when you're with your friends, when you're finally old enough to go out with them afterwards, like all of those things were canceled for me. And Bailey and I had talked about this a lot too. Like, it was our junior year when the pandemic hit. I graduated at the end of that year because I finished my credits, but we were both in the same space where, like, it's a really busy year in terms of workload. And so in the fall, we had actively held off on doing a lot of fun activities in favor of like getting work done. And so we were really like looking forward to the light at the end of the tunnel of those last few months of school, where we could really start to have fun and spend more time with our peers and hang out and do all the fun parts of school. And so it was really, really depressing for me, to the point where by the end, I didn't even like want to have my lessons anymore, because I was just like, what am I like, why am I learning new rep? I'm graduating and I don't know what kind of career I'm going to have next. There were certain days where I'm like, oh, I have all day. I can practice. I can like arrange music that I want to arrange and make a video. And this is great. Like, we're digitizing it all. And then other days where it just felt so pointless. Like, I barely wanted to log into class. Like, I would have lessons where we would just sight read music together because my teacher was like, well, you have to have these lessons, but I know like your brain just isn't in the right spot. So for me, without having more school to look forward to, I think it was kind of a blessing and a curse. It definitely like ruined my last final experience of school, but also I think having the extra time and not having to think about continuing school allowed me to focus more on career building online, which is a lot more viable now than it used to be, and wasn't really something I considered very seriously before.
For me, since I took all 4 years for my undergrad, I was able to, at that point in COVID, have a performance of my recital just without an audience. So that was really nice that I could do that. But on the other hand, it was a year and a half of online music school, which for me, I think I had the drive to be like, I want to play a good recital. I want to end my music career on a good note. But at the same time, COVID just instilled such a sense of panic that I was like, oh my God, I need to get a job. So I could have graduated a semester early, but I ended up splitting my last year between 2 part-time semesters and worked full-time. And I enjoyed it. It was fun, and I was making money, which I think like the idea of graduating without stability of some kind like really shook me, knowing that there wasn't even a way for me to penetrate the gig scene enough to make it at that point. So it was like the money's going to have to come from somewhere. But in that, I kind of, realized that I had never taken proper time away from my instrument. So after I played my senior recital, I kind of closed the flute case for a while and explored other things. And that was good and it was healthy. But I think like the biggest thing that I felt, and that I know still exists amongst current COVID college students, is a real sense of panic about how the heck am I going to live after this, because it was already hard. Like being a freelancer, even being a public school teacher, like all of these music jobs were not easy to find before. Sure. And now we're graduating in a market that's still like nearly impossible. So I was very lucky that I was able to find a job this year, but I spent my first 6 months after graduation working 7 days a week just to be able to pay rent, and that's it.
Well, the listeners of our podcast are not going to be familiar with when you started yours. So tell us a little bit about how starting the podcast maybe played as like an escape valve for some of these things that you're talking about. And also, I'm curious about, you guys mentioned doing a lot of online work. And I would say that sphere has expanded considerably and imaginatively, particularly since the pandemic. But it was kind of in that trajectory anyway. And do you guys have any kind of hopes based on what you have learned during this time in your online work about where our field could go in the future?
It was a bit like therapy for us in the beginning, and we spent a handful of episodes only talking to each other. And then I think when we started to expand to peers and to people that we reached out to, like professors, and then eventually just other classical musicians and artists that we looked up to, we started to see like how everybody that we considered to be really successful and had fulfilling careers got to it in funny, strange, or like not so straightforward ways. And that like there were so many stories of failure, or what seemed like failure at the time, or just like dumb luck, or meeting the right people, being at the right place at the right time. And I think that's something that like in our grind hustle, like you got to work so hard for everything culture, we didn't necessarily realize. So in a way it was really optimistic, because we were like, oh, we're meeting so many people, we're kind of like networking at the same time, and we have a platform now and people take us seriously.
So, I mean, one question that I have for you guys is, I'm looking at your list of guests and you've had close to 50 now. And I'm just wondering, like, tell me one or two surprises, because I mean, as you said, when you started this, it was like a lot of venting and stuff, and you had a lot of common cause with your guests. But after talking to all of these people, I just wonder if, what are like one or two real surprises and something that maybe you have integrated in a surprising way into your own thinking.
A big surprise that we had is actually in an episode that hasn't been released yet. We had the opportunity to go to the University of Maryland and speak with their students and record a live podcast with their students, which was so cool. I can't even believe we got to do it, still talking about it now. But something that was very surprising is that the young students, like the college freshmen of today, have such a strong grasp on interdisciplinarity and discovering your whole self compared to what we had. And we don't consider ourselves that much older than that.
Nor do I.
And I think with the guests that we've talked to, like the ones that are more established than us, that we've kind of invited on as a way of like picking their brain, another surprising thing along those lines is how much these like what we consider to be like the classical musician of our dreams, they're not thinking about classical music all the time. They've all expressed other interests, other passions, other hobbies, other things that they want to be doing and building, and goals for themselves that are completely outside of the realm of just music. And I think that really allowed Bailey and I, because we both have had interdisciplinary tendencies, I think our whole lives, we both have been interested in visual arts and a lot of other topics. And so I think our podcast was our first step to exploring some of how that comes together with music, but just hearing how many other things that people fit into their lives on top of a successful classical music career made us realize, like, oh, we don't have to feel bad about spending our days doing other things. Like, they will come together, or if they don't, they'll be a perfectly fulfilling way to have spent our time.
Well, with that, I think it might be time to turn it over and actually talk about the classical GABFEST set of baggage that we have. So we're going to turn it over to Tiff for the second topic, and we'll go from there.
In the coming weeks, as part of our collaboration with Serena and Bailey, Kensho, Will, and I will be appearing as guests on the Creative Baggage podcast individually. But to give you a taste of what the show is all about, we thought that we'd share some of our own creative baggage as a sort of preview of those episodes. So we'll hand the reins over. Serena and Bailey, take it away.
Okay, so I figured we could throw out some questions that you can kind of just round robin it, and so everyone can answer for themselves. But one of the biggest things that I want to know is the moments of epiphany or realization in your career. Like, what are the biggest ones that you've had so far?
I mean, I think that the epiphany to me has been similar to what you guys were talking about, which is that any ideas that I had about following a certain career path because that was like the thing to do, or that was the way to get famous or renowned or rich or whatever, had to be thrown out the window at some point, not only because like they just weren't going to happen for me, and you get to a certain age and you realize that you're not the spring chicken, you're not the young artist anymore, you're not this, you're not that, but also that like, if those were going to happen for me, like, then that would have been meant to have happened. Like, that would have been my personality. That's what I would have pursued. Like, I would have gone out for every conducting competition. I would have submitted to every composition contest. And I didn't do any of those things because I didn't like want to, or I didn't care about them. You know, it's like, I didn't enjoy that. What I enjoyed was the artistic side. I enjoyed being able to do my own thing. And that's what I've figured out a way to do for myself. And that's not much easier than going, you know, one of these more traditional competitive routes. But I don't really care for the competitive aspect of the music business. I care for the artistic side. I care for expressing myself somehow. You know, I'm interested in a lot of like weird corners of the repertoire, like, you know, Carl Maria von Weber piano concertos, right? I mean, like
that's like the most like normal corner.
Yeah, and that's
of
the
world
most
that
normal the repertoire element that I'm interested in. So, you know, I think that it's been a slowly dawning epiphany that if I am going to sustain myself, my career, my soul in this industry, it has to be on my own terms. And if that means that I don't get the fame and fortune or even the security that would be afforded with a more traditional career path, in the end, that's what works for me.
I don't know about moments of epiphany in my career, but just hearing you guys talk about it, I mean, there's always a sense of you want to put yourself in the perspective of other folks in doing this. So like I'm a teacher recently, and it's like, okay, so there's resistance now to the idea that there has to be one path. But well, first of all, to get into the conducting path at all is to recognize that there is no one path. I mean, if there's this one single advice that I've heard ad nauseum in this career, it's like, there's no path, which is not entirely true by itself anyway, but we can get into that later. But to think about this without getting yourself into this adversarial mindset, which is, I mean, I think we do risk that as musicians. We get into the idea of like, it's you against the world. The world is telling you this. Society is telling you this. Okay, well, yes, but like, is it your job to fight society? Is that where we are here? And for me, like the way into, I'm going to go real cliche here and say inner peace is not to get trapped in the mindset of thinking, well, I have to make the, you know, for me, because as soon as I go down that path, I end up in a real dark place. And it's very frustrating to sit there and feel like, well, you know, because of these pressures and such and such and such, I feel, well, okay, so now from a teacher, I'm actually getting a lived experience that does give me that magnanimity to say, well, of course students are frustrated that I treat them this way and I expect practice from them and that I set expectations. So I can have this olive branch, right? I can greet everybody by name. I can send people individual emails that ask how they are, and I can express to them that I recognize their whole humanhood or personhood or whatever the lingo is now, right? I can do all these things. But in the end, I am still a teacher, and it is still my job to impart these skills and to believe in the value of imparting those skills to the point where that doesn't feel like an inhumane machine that I'm expecting students to go through. So, for me, in viewing societal pressures that I sometimes feel as a woman or as a woman conductor or as Asian American and so on, it is not always that instructive for me to think about the way I feel because somebody else did something to me.
Well, it's funny because I don't know, the two of you didn't have such pure epiphanous moments, but for me it was very much a case of, first of all, I had to actually decide to even go into the arts, to go into music, because I thought I was going to be a doctor. So that, I think Will was already privy to that kind of back and forth that I was feeling when I was 21, 22 was it when I met you, Will?
Yeah, I think so. Mm-hmm.
For me that moment obviously had been building up in terms of trying to do both pre-med stuff and violin at that time. It wasn't even conducting. And then it kind of came to a head when I first discovered conducting and then felt very strongly for that. And then trying to balance that with this very well laid track to medical school that I had been setting up since I was 5 years old, that I was, just meant to be doing that. So in that way, the moment was kind of when I was writing my personal statement for medical school, where I had to write why I wanted to be a doctor and, wrote something pretty, well worded and everything. And then reading it over and realizing that none of it was true. And that was kind of a incredible moment of reading your own writing and realizing that it's all BS. So definitely that moment. But then also I think this going back to the idea of pressures that we all feel, when you decide to do something when you're 5 years old or whatever, and you're kind of thinking that you're meant to do it, you also are pairing that with also the career in medicine, which is sometimes glorified in terms of the stability and also the income that it comes with, but it's also not at all what it's chalked up to be in terms of the, obviously if you get to a certain level as a well-established doctor, but it's not an easy path toward financial stability either in terms of how much money you actually invest into your own education. So part of the fear of jumping off was also the fear of losing that stability in terms of my career and then going into the arts. And then also knowing that conducting was such a recent discovery, I felt like I was already behind the eight ball with some of my colleagues that came out of the womb thinking that they were going to be conductors. So all of that was kind of tearing me into two pieces in a way until I decided it didn't matter to me how far I made it or how famous I became or how successful I was in terms of the eyes of other people, that this definitely was something that I wanted to do and I wanted to pursue it as far as it would allow me to. So it was incredibly freeing to kind of jump off that cliff and see where I would land.
Okay, so something maybe digging a little bit deeper, but I wanted to ask both what everyone's most vulnerable or feeling of insecurity or the moments of that in your career, and also the most validating. What were the times that you felt yes, this is exactly what I should be doing, and the moments of doubt that I'm sure we've all felt?
So in the category of most vulnerable, I mean, easily it's not going to be a single moment, but it's kind of a span of period after I had decided to go into conducting. And like I mentioned before, nobody tells you this is the way to do it because, yes, okay, it's true. There ain't no one way to do it. But there were certain things that I felt what am I knocking, this door that I'm knocking on that nobody is telling me what's right behind it? Okay, fine. I'm still processing the fact that at that point it made me very bitter. One of the early steps in becoming a conductor is attending these master classes, right? Where they make you pay up the wazoo and you get to conduct an orchestra for 10 minutes or whatever it is. So I audited a class. This is maybe a couple months after I had graduated and just was flailing out in the world and doing whatever. And I had decided not to do public policy, which was my major in undergrad, and to try and do this conducting thing that nobody was telling me how to do. And I went to this master class, and I was just an auditor. It's one where you kind of sit and watch the people who actually have conducted before conduct, because that's who they tend to let do these master classes. Anyway, so I was at this, and every conversation that I would have with somebody that I was trying to get some advice from seemed to focus on the fact that nobody felt like I wanted it bad enough. And that was extremely frustrating for me, right? So like, I mean, I remember kind of breaking down in tears over dinner, like with this like esteemed group of people who were like doing what I was wanting to be doing and being like, oh, I don't know. And I felt very interrogated. I felt really kind of, you know, if I've said that I want to do this thing, and then people are still asking me to justify why I want to do this thing, is that not good enough? You know, is it not good enough that I want to do it? Like, you need all my reasons? You need me to bare my soul to you and tell me about my childhood trauma and like that doesn't exist? What do you want from me, you know? So that dinner and that masterclass, which I incorporate into my kind of personal lore, I think that is one of those moments, not of epiphany, but just as of momentousness in my trajectory, in my career. That would certainly count as an early moment of extreme vulnerability. And I guess to counteract that, I mean, you know, so I go through life, you know, being I would describe my style as kind of competence and just like I wouldn't say chill, but like I don't like drama and I don't like the temperature to be high where I am, but I'm pretty blunt, right? So I get into situations where I know very quickly how to do the job that I've been assigned to do, and I will go above and beyond, and I will do a lot of the things that I, you know, haven't been asked to do. And then I find that my fuse burns pretty short when things are not going from other people's ends the way that I perceive that they should go. And so the moment when I started to get a little bit more confident actually is where I started to realize, okay, well, I'm getting impatient with other people and I need to now put myself on the other side of the perspective, right? Like I am the one who knows how it's supposed to go. I am the one who sees clearly how, you know, how these, I mean, to make it a mountain out of a molehill, how these copies should be made, you know, in what order you should scan things in and to send people. Things like that. It's just like, you know what your own competence is. Once you start to realize that, okay, you actually are adults, you actually are competent, a lot of this stuff falls away. I mean, you know, just leaping into the teaching sphere for the first time in the last couple of years, it's like, well, of course, no institute of higher education has ever given me a title as esteemed as assistant professor of blah, 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 blah before. But I'm perfectly capable of the job. You put me on my feet on the ground in that place and you ask me what to do, I'm going to be like, here's what you need to do. I know the things. And so that gradual realization, which I guess came about during the course of my doctoral degree at University of Maryland, is part of the latter half of that story of just kind of gaining confidence and like, I know what the skills are. I have them. Here they are.
You know, for me, the vulnerability was really centered around the fact that I don't have a strong background as an instrumentalist in music. You know, I learned viola through my public school's music program, and I learned strings from a saxophone player. So, you know, I didn't have like private lessons. I never learned how to play the piano. And so approaching my career, whenever I was going to be working with professional musicians, especially ones like in a major orchestra or something, or even honestly music majors, like there was no music major in instrumental music at my college. So sometimes I would do gigs or projects where I would bring in, you know, instrument majors from like Northwestern University. And I was like always sort of nervous about that. Like I thought these people were like the end all be all because I didn't have those skills. And come to find out, I mean, when I got my first job as being an assistant conductor at a major orchestra, like I had ears, like I had this other set of skills, you know, I mean, and I understood the structure of the music from being a composer. And just because I couldn't play the music at the level that these people could play it, like that's fine. Like we all have our own competencies. Like I could hear what I could do to help them make it better. So that was both a vulnerability and a feeling of validation in the end. But it's something that I still struggle with a little bit.
I don't know. A lot of crap happens when you're taking auditions or doing master classes. I think I don't know if it's the same with flutists, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when there's like more than 5 or 6 conductors in a room
it's the worst thing
audition
ever.
or a master class setting, there's nothing that makes you feel like more inadequate than ever, because everyone is just trying to one up each other in terms of how much they know or what they can do or all this. And so I'm not a pianist, and a lot of these auditions that you take for schools for conducting require you to play something on the piano, whether it's open scores or just kind of to display your piano skills in some way. And so this has always been like something I'm just really bad at, and you know, it's just slow. It's just really slow. And there are people that will come out of it and just, talk about how well they played. Oh yeah, like, opening of Tristan and Isolde. Yeah, it's weird transpositions, but yeah, I got through to the, whatever bar. And then I'm just like, okay, crap. Like if I can make it through bar 5, And going back to what I was saying earlier, because I didn't decide to be a conductor until much later, like I always felt already behind the ball in a way. So it only like confirmed like, oh crap, like these people know way more or have way more experience in whatever it is. And just knowing that like Will said, like it's not just about that, it's about a lot of other things. And one of the things that I'm really thankful for with what we do as conductors is that it requires so many different skills. So like it doesn't even matter if you're at the top 0.01% in one skill. If you don't have the others, it's actually a hindrance, more of a hindrance than if you were just kind of average or mediocre at everything.
So that's the lesson here, guys.
Be mediocre
definitely.
At everything.
I love that.
Well, listeners, if you like what you've heard in this segment, feel free to check out Serena and Bailey's podcast, Creative Baggage, and you'll be hearing yours truly, as well as Kensho and Will, on the show in the coming weeks at some point. So with that, let's move on to our third segment for today. Will?
All right, well, our final topic for today was suggested by Bailey and Serena, and it has to do with the National Flute Association Convention, which took place this summer, and some controversy swirling around it. On June 14th of 2021, flutist Leanna Keith wrote a post on Facebook. This year, I am participating in the National Flute Association Convention in more ways than I ever have, on panels that I am truly proud to be a part of. I was going to urge you to buy a ticket to watch the live stream to see these things that I am so proud to be doing. But then I took a look at the cost. The pricing is astronomical, not for a regular convention, but for an online convention which has absolutely no venue. For a convention that does not pay its performers, for a convention which is happening after one of the worst pandemics in recent history, where musicians and music educators have lost income drastically and cannot possibly spend $300 on what is essentially recordings and Zoom calls. The National Flute Convention's response? Dear Leanna, it is certainly time for NFA to address these issues and look for a new model of inclusion and affordability. It is unfortunate that NFA has not, in its 49 years, ever created an institutional fundraising program, relying instead on support from our commercial colleagues and registrations. Unfortunately, moving forward, this model will not serve our community, and due to COVID-19, the steep decline in commercial support has already created a significant dent in our income. Creating a more equitable tomorrow for NFA will take some doing and some time, but we are listening and we are committed to change. The prices for this Zoom conference ranged from $150 for students at an early bird price, which also included their membership dues, to $325 for non-students. Professional development conferences such as this are a common feature of the classical landscape and do in fact raise questions about financial equity and access in our industry. And so that's our jumping off point for our discussion today. So this is, quite a hefty price for a Zoom convention, and we should get into some other models for funding. But Serena and Bailey, I just thought I would ask you first, what actually happened? Did either of you go to this convention on Zoom this summer?
I did not go on Zoom. I've been twice to their regular conventions, which usually take place in a major hotel, and it's in a different city every year. So I went to the one in Chicago and I went to the one in DC, and basically it's about 3 days of like back-to-back and even simultaneous events. So there are recitals being given, lectures, question and answer sessions, even things happening in the hallway, like flute choir events.
And how much did it cost?
About that.
That's my understanding, is that there was no discount for the fact that this was a Zoom event, that these are just the regular prices for what their normal conventions would have been in person, and now is the same thing on Zoom. What about you, Tiffany and Kensho? Have you been to such conventions as these?
I'm bored by conventions as a practice, so no. But it staggers me, right, that like they didn't think that, okay, we're migrating online, like let's cut the cost a little, because, what were they thinking? I assume that in normal years, they're pretty much just trying to break even hosting the convention.
Right.
But presumably it does include their renting the space to host the convention. And presumably, in most cases, for most arts organizations hosting an event, the space rental is maybe the biggest line item in the budget, I would anticipate. I don't know.
I mean, to put it into perspective, I went to the American Musicological Conference in 2019, and the whole thing cost me $150, including my Airbnb. The student admission was free, and it was at a venue.
So academics have conferences all the time, and generally speaking, the institution that they're from helps cover the cost of their going to the conference. And also, one line item that I anticipate that a flute convention would have, especially given that performances are a big part of what goes on, is paying your artists. People don't typically get paid to present at most conferences in academia. They go because it develops their career. The honorarium for presenting your work at a conference is shockingly low for a lot of these things. And so looking at this from the other side, again, if you see this from, let's say, an artist perspective, oh, I've been invited to perform at the National Flute Convention, but they want me to perform for exposure, or whatever. They are paying their artists to perform recitals. You can guarantee it.
Well, they don't get paid ever.
Really?
Yeah.
They don't pay their artists to perform at the flute convention?
No.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, even the big, like the big ones, like your James Galway-esque people.
Well, let me just jump in here as somebody who follows a bunch of musicologists on Twitter. All it is endless griping about the amount of money that they have to pay to go to their conferences. So there are a lot of, grad student musicologists. They're in the same boat as instrumentalists. I've been involved in a number of these conferences, mainly the music ed ones, as a conductor for all states. And so, yeah, I mean, there's all of these professional development seminars that take place. And then there's usually a big sales floor where people hawk their wares. At flute conferences, probably like, I don't know, what, pads for the buttons that you push, or
The buttons.
mouthpieces. I don't know what the hell you guys do. But anyway, at the state conferences for like music ed, there's all these like batons set up. I mean, you wouldn't believe how many people, can just get a lathe and build their own baton business. But, I wanted to mention about this funding thing. I'm going to be involved after a fashion in the National Conference of the American Guild of Organists this summer. My involvement is as a composer, not as an organist, but I did just see something on their Facebook that apparently one of the chapters, I think it's the Houston chapter, is sponsoring all of the participants below like a certain level of, students or whatever. Like they're just ponying up the money. So I guess that there are alternative funding forms, but, just to play a little bit of devil's advocate here, obviously this organization wants to have money in the bank for the next time that it does a conference. And by charging some money this year, perhaps they can defray future costs. And the other thing is that they said that a lot of this comes down to their commercial partners, right? So, I mean, at a conference, you would have one of these very glossy pamphlets that everybody would get. There'd be all of this advertising for the keypads or whatever, and they would make some money that way. An association like this, given that its main purpose is the professional development of its members, to offer these kind of networking opportunities and performance opportunities and stuff. Like, it's not like a typical not-for-profit. You're not going to be able to go to like charitable fundraisers and say like, you should make a donation of $100,000 for our flute conference. I would think that a better model would be sort of a pay what you can kind of thing, so that then you might encourage some people who are young or something, throw in a little skin in the game, like, give us $5. I mean, that's a good way to get somebody in through the door, say that you're going to participate. You understand that there is value to this, but, you just don't have that money to spend for it. And then what you hope to do, I think, as an organization like this is develop that giving starting from a very small level. As people progress in their career, they have more money to donate. And then, people at the very top level, like the big principal flute players of like the top orchestras, they should be able to give like $1,000. I mean, in terms of what they want to contribute to the community. At least that's an idea that I had. I don't know. Kensho, what do you think about all this?
While we were just discussing, I was on GuideStar and I'm looking at the National Flute Association's tax forms. So I'm just scrolling through it right now. The first thing that kind of jumped out at me was the statement of revenue, and they break down basically like where the revenue is coming from. So of the total revenue gross, I'm assuming membership dues made up $200,000 roughly in comparison to other contributions, gifts, grants, and similar amounts not included above, blah, 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 is $135,000. So they're basically basing their entire kind of budget revenue off of these membership dues. And then if you look further, convention fees also takes up a huge block of their revenue, which is it's literally $423,000 that year in terms of just the convention fees. I'm only saying this because the quote that the National Flute Convention had in terms of saying that in its 49 years, they haven't ever created an institutional fundraising program is kind of also odd to me. Like if it's 49 years in running and it's this like big thing that everyone is also, it's supposed to kind of, support flutists in the country or whatever, why is it that they're not raising money for that and offsetting some of these costs? And also, I mean, it's also just kind of surprising, as we've already discussed, that they're not paying their artists to perform either. And I feel like some of that money could be going towards that as well.
There are maybe less than 4 or 5 scholarships to the convention on a normal year. And in order to get those, you have to not only write essays, but submit videos and prove your income. So it's like they're parading that they're featuring, artists of color or more women composers and all that, when in fact, to get to the convention at an accessible price, you have to, first of all, start 6 months in advance. And second, fill out enough paperwork. You might as well be applying for like housing, And I think like ultimately this year, what our frustration was it was an opportunity to give the convention to people who may not have been able to before because it's online, right? There's no plane ticket. There's none of this, none of that. But yet still, the only way you were getting in for free is if you were writing a 6-paragraph essay with 7 recommendations and all your tax forms in the last 10 years. Because I filled out one of those scholarships my junior year of high school, and it took me almost as long as, like, if not longer than my college applications. I think that's kind of where people started to really raise an eyebrow, because yes, everything we've talked about is a little bit concerning, but then when you factor in like the barrier to entry being so high, you wonder like where the orientation of the organization truly is.
That's a very good point, a great final point to wrap the segment on. And I'm sure that a lot of our listeners have been to such conventions, and we'd be very interested in knowing what they think about their experiences there and the fees involved and these issues of equity and inclusion. But with that, I think it's time to move on to our classical mixtape. Kensho.
In our classical mixtape, we each recommend some music that's caught our ear this week to share with our listeners. So, Bailey, what would you like to share with our listeners?
So I wanted to share a piece that I'm learning. I'm just starting to play again regularly. I'm doing the 75 hard challenge, but I'm putting music in it. So basically I have to do a lot of things every day, and one of them is practice. And something I'm working on now is the Gaubert Fantaisie, which is a pretty classical, like classic in the sense of popular flute piece that's in kind of the big section of repertoire that is French flute music. So it's very fun, shows off the technique of the flute, and it's very, very French.
Thank you, Bailey. As you might know, this show loves French music, and including some flute to that is also very great. Thank you. Serena, what do you have for us?
I have a specific recording of Bailey and my former teacher, Mimi Stillman, playing with her Dolce Suono ensemble the Saint-Saëns Caprice on Danish and Russian airs. I really, really have always loved this recording, and I hope that I'll get to play it sometime soon.
Thank you. And now Tiffany.
My recommendation this week is like way out there. So if you listeners are used to kind of having our mixtape go and just kind of nicely chill into it, you might want to skip this one.
No, this is like a Will White.
Actually, I'm very excited about this. I think it's super cool.
This is Beowulf dramatically read by a fellow named Benjamin Bagby, who also, he kind of half sings a lot of it, but he's also playing this medieval harp, which resembles the lyre that I brought onto this podcast a few weeks ago in our gift-giving segment. But this is wild. I mean, it's like an hour and a half long, and it's like, I mean, I think it's memorized. I think he's not like, looking
It's
at
not excerpts, like the whole thing.
It's the whole thing, and he's just telling the story, and it's in Old English, so you can't understand a word he's saying, but of course there's subtitles so that but like the drama is all there. You really get a sense of how, in the sense that we like read epic poetry, and right now, like studying epic poetry like this is like exclusively the domain of English classes, right? But like there is a significantly musical thread that runs through the oral tradition and the performing tradition of epics like this, and I think that nothing in our modern day kind of demonstrates this as much as this dude does. So please enjoy it and like watch it also.
Seth his wordes sjøveld vide hevne. Hei, Bernjarle Bergestad, det synket simple, selv livet det herren hånd, ja. Helloen med smad, ladan lies. Nå is it lenge for jintet så et hette Adam Swerian efter well neither quick not shoulder.
It's so not like you to suggest something like this, Tiffany. So we're going to have to discuss this later about why this is coming up right now in this moment.
I know.
All right, Will.
All right, well, picking up from our prelude segment about Schubert and Weber, I spoke very highly of Weber's music, obviously, and now I want to throw in a little bit of Schubert that I discovered recently. This is a performance of the introduction and variations on Trockne Blumen, which I understand is actually often played on the flute.
Yes, I'm learning it.
In this case, it is performed by Alexei Kenny, violin, and Renana Gutmann, piano. The only reason that I found out about it is because I am actually like obsessed with Alexei Kenny.
Oh, boy.
I know that I've promoted him on the podcast before, but this is a great performance of a very interesting piece. So that's my mixtape recommendation this week.
Thank you, Will. No surprise, Alexei makes another appearance on the mixtape here. I, like Bailey, am suggesting something that I'm working on at the moment. In a few weeks, I'm doing, for the first time, Clara Schumann's Piano Concerto. And do you guys know this piece at all?
Oh, yeah.
This is the movement with the big cello solo, right?
Yes, it's the moment actually that has the cello solo, and there's the only reason why I mention this now is because it would be such a good fake out for like Name That Tune.
Here is a cello concerto.
Yeah, because it's like just piano and cello, and it sounds like it could be from a cello sonata or something, but it's actually the second movement of this great piano concerto by Clara Schumann. So this particular performance is by Isa de Cannes with the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic Orchestra. find the links to all these and to our full classical mixtape playlist in the show notes.
And with that, it's time to wrap up this episode of the Classical GABFEST. I'm Tiffany Liu, and on behalf of Kensho Watanabe and William White, I'd like to thank our guests today, and thank you so much for listening, and to encourage you to subscribe and rate us on your podcast app. We'd also love your help spreading the word about the show on social media, where you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can reach us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, happy listening, and we'll be with you next week.